Welcome to the dialogue.
In this episode of the Dialogue podcast, we're revisiting our interview with American Leadership Forum Senior Fellow Phaedra Ellis-Lamkins of Class 16. Suzanne St. John Crane, ALF Silicon Valley CEO and the Dialogue podcast executive producer, sat down with Phaedra in 2019 to discuss the leadership roles that catapulted her to the work of creating a more just, equitable, and inclusive world. Phaedra's eclectic career path included leading the South Bay Labor Council, working to expand universal health care for children, and working with Prince in reclaiming ownership of his music catalog. Her latest venture, Promise, is a decarceration startup that uses technology to reduce recidivism, minimize costs, and promote public safety. Here's the interview.
"12 million people cycle through local jails every year, with more than 70% incarcerated pre-trial, meaning they've not yet been convicted of the charge for which they were arrested. The vast majority of those remain in jail because they can't afford to get out." I had the opportunity to speak with ALF Senior Fellow Phaedra Ellis-Lamkins, co-founder and CEO of Promise, an Oakland, California-based tech company focused on decarceration and working with government agencies to tackle the issue of mass incarceration. Phaedra and I spoke about how her upbringing, ALF experience, and work in the labor movement shaped her career path and her passion for equity. Can innovative partnerships between government and tech lead to safer and stronger communities? Let's listen. So Phaedra, Class 16.
Yeah.
What pieces of the experience were memorable for you from your ALF Fellows year?
I think, one, I really liked the group of people in my class.
Yeah.
I have some long-standing friendships. I think Mark Jones was in my class, and I still see him really regularly and love him and enjoy him.
Ditto.
Right?
Ditto. He's a great guy.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think it probably was a class. I also think our class was a group who organized, right? Like in a non-traditional way, really to think about kind of what programming was most helpful. And I think it was a tipping point for me personally, thinking about what did leadership development look like and what networks existed and like what networks did you want to have.
Right.
So that to me was probably the most valuable thing that ALF did for me, is it made me realize that cross-sectional networks was really critical.
Right.
And also that people who believed different things than I did could have be inherently good people. Because I think when you're in politics and in social change, a lot of times you think like, if you disagree with me, you're a bad human. And it was interesting to meet good humans who I thought had very bad politics.
You're a fierce leader.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I don't feel like that every day, so I appreciate that.
Fierce,
I appreciate that.
You've won recognitions like 40 Under 40, the Business Journal and whatnot, and executive director of South Bay Labor Council at one point, representing over 100 unions, 10,000 union members. So I have to ask, like, what key people and experiences as a young person helped shape your values? How did you come to be and be so fierce?
I appreciate the compliment because I really don't feel that way all the time. I think unfortunately, I think trauma teaches you a lot, right? And I grew up, my dad's very violent. I had a lot of like not great things happen to me as a kid. And I think I probably established pretty early on that I wanted to live my life differently, which was a guiding force for me, right? Part of why I didn't have a partner for a long time is because I was like, I just want to like not have anyone be violent or treat me poorly. I want to be not in an economic situation where I'm stuck. I want to make sure other people don't feel stuck. And so for me, I think it was largely trauma that shaped me early on. Mm-hmm. And then I think the labor movement in Silicon Valley is a magical place. And I now have worked in a lot of places that would be considered magical to other people. But the labor movement has some of the most amazing humans. It's the first place I met good men. Mm. It was the first place I met men who were like authentically good people and who were for you and righteous leaders. And so I think from going to kind of a trauma childhood to college, because I went to the labor movement when I was 19, and I think that shaped me. Just that sense of like, good people get together and do good things. Right. Everyone from our leaders who were members, who were janitors, who were struggling, working 2 jobs, putting their kids through school, to like Cindy Chavez, who I was an intern for, and Bob Brownstein, who I will love for the rest of my life, who just were like, just for you and good. And it helped me when I went to work at Green for All, because I was just like, oh, wow, these are like, it gave me a strong foundation that I think people who've lived through trauma need.
One milestone in your career thus far, anyway, has been just the effort at working partnerships to expand healthcare for kids, right? In the county, expanding it to 160,000 kids. It's been replicated.
Yeah.
How did you, this is a question I've been looking forward to asking you. How did you work within those existing stuck public sector systems? Very frustrating to many, slow moving at times, to really get this done.
Well, one, I think Cindy was incredible. She was on the city council at that time. I think Amy in the labor movement was great. And Bob is the chief architect, right? And I don't think he gets enough credit for that. I also think it was a fight about defining who the labor movement was and what we were for. Because I think we'd been having a lot of fights where people didn't understand what we were about. And it's hard if you say, I'm going to use the power of the labor movement to help people that are not our members, which is what Children's Health Insurance did, but we recognize if we can make the case to people that the labor movement having power means that other people win, not just union members, that was really important. And so I think working in those systems, one is we had incredible power to elect people. Right. So people knew we weren't going to do something that was going to get them unelected. Two is we were using tobacco money, and people were literally using tobacco money to build bigger offices, build jails. And so the idea that you would do that was crazy. And I think then we had foundations that really stood up, the endowment and Blue Shield and others, who said, we're willing to put money in. So we can go to the public sector and say, we're going to offer you money. Right. And then we have an idea that we think is a winning idea. And then we've had to fight some people who are fellows, so I will not talk about them as elected officials.
Happens.
Right? And I think then when you have morality, public will, a good policy, and money to add to it, I think those things are really important. And I also think it was important because the city was not in the business of healthcare. Right. And so it was like it was like a moral debate, which is very much easier in the public sector than a pragmatic debate.
This is really, evidence of a reoccurring value and thread in your career.
Yeah.
In fact, I wanted to ask you about in 2003, you led the launch of Partnership for Working Families, a national coalition dedicated to building power and reshaping the economy and urban environment for workers and communities. Tell us, what were you able to accomplish in that effort during that time that you're most proud of?
I think the fact that people think living wages and community benefits agreements are a common thing is probably the most important, because when we were doing it, the Mercury News did an op-ed, we were going to destroy the local economy with living wage, community benefits agreement. The mayor then, the economic development person, just wrote how this would destroy development in Silicon Valley. And so now that I saw that same person in a different context, because it was in a different state, and he was they're advocating for community benefits, which I totally appreciated the irony of. But I think the idea that that public sector resources should be used for good, and that is scalable and acceptable, is something now that we take for granted, which we certainly did not take for granted when we were doing that. When the Chamber of Commerce was against us. I had sat down with the head of the op-eds. Opinion pages, they were horrific.
Yeah. And you changed the conversation.
Right. And when we did airport living wage, they supported it. And so the idea that we'd gone from this awful labor movement, doing these crazy ideas, and now that both the community that we were in San Jose, but then also across the country, that really the Partnership for Working Families was about how did you scale those ideas and take them to other places. And now that I'm not in the labor movement, the people that originally started in it aren't in it anymore, and that those ideas exist and teams exist. And that no one knows we did it, which is the best. That means that the ideas become someone else's, which I think is the kind of work I want. The best achievement is where it's not Phaedra, it's not Madeline, it's not any of the people who were Donald or any of the people there. Now the stories of people who are there now, which means it's much more successful to me.
Then you moved on to Green for All. Let's talk about that. You joined as CEO in 2009. Green for All was built to form a coalition of a broad range of groups, many of whom are not known for their engagement in climate and energy issues. So what brought you there?
My friend Van, I was thinking about Obama had just been elected, and I was very excited. And I was like, I want to go to D.C. And then my nieces came to live with me, and it changed my life because I went from being a single, oh, yay, I'm going to go to D.C. and be part of this change. And all of a sudden I had kids. And so it just meant that I wasn't in a place where it made sense to be going to Washington, D.C. So I knew I was ready to leave the labor movement, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And my friend Van wanted to go to the White House. And we always joke it worked out better for me. And he is just incredibly remarkable, inspiring, and I believed in the vision. And I think more than just the vision for the work, I had started really thinking a lot about forgiveness work and the way in which we work with one another. We'd had this vote in the labor movement, and we won 9-1. And one of our staff was like, oh, talking about that one person. And I just thought, like, that can't be who we are, right? Like, we just transformed. We got to watch these leaders do this incredible work where now someone wasn't going to be homeless anymore and a woman got to stay in her apartment. And this, like, the narrative of our work should be like leaders standing up for their families out of love and out of compassion and out of justice. And it just felt like that moment wouldn't exist in San Jose. I ended up in DC a lot, which I didn't anticipate. And we worked a lot with people like the Congressional Black Caucus. And part of what we learned is that the environmental movement had not done a good job of talking to people. Like, the environmental movement would have been fired if it were a company, because the people most impacted, they ignored, right? It was like, who's most likely to be, it is an issue of environmental justice, but it's also just the basic, like, Emmanuel Cleaver, who's an amazing Congress member, his mom had died of an asthma attack, or I forget who it was. No, the daughter of someone had died of an asthma attack. And on the front lawn. And like, people have these incredible stories of how their life has been impacted by climate. Yeah. And that those folks aren't leading, or at least connected at that time, was incredible to me. And so I felt lucky that we got to say, hey, if you are negatively impacted or by this, and you should get to be a leader in this movement. And that was part of it.
And you guys had a huge win, too, with the American Clean Energy and Security Act. Talk to us about how you were able to include that $860 million for green job training. And
I mean, I think there's a lot of, like, really good victories, which were really about coalitions of different types of people. I also think Van deserves so much credit, because I think what he understands that very few people do, at least at that time, was how important storytelling and a narrative is, and the idea that it's not like, like, I always joke with him that he can be like, I would have been in a place many years ago where if I saw someone I disagreed with, I'd be like, oh, devil, like, we shouldn't talk to them. And he would be like, let's all come together and pray, or like, find peace.
Kumbaya.
But then that worked, right? And I think the reason those victories happened, and I think even he's, just on the stuff, this First Step Act is because the recognition that, like, even if you disagree with someone, like, the ability to be able to come together around a common issue is really critical, I think, as you think about ALF and others. And I just think he lives that.
Let's talk about Prince for a second.
Yeah.
So I had been on the job maybe a month at ALF, and I remember getting the news that he had passed. And I'll just say that I've been a musician for 20 years, and I'm one of the ladies of the 80s, right? So he and Purple Rain just totally had a huge influence on me. And I was sitting in my office, and my coworker, who's about my age, we got the news, and it was like, just hit us like a brick wall. I mean, it was very tragic. Yeah. And, I was watching CNN that night, and of course, Van Jones was talking about Prince, and he said, emphatically talking about your role in his life. And I said, God, that name, I know that name. I think she's a senior fellow. Tell me what you're willing to share just about what you guys learned from each other.
Yeah. I mean, I learned so much from him. Yeah. The first thing is, I had never had someone that I think I worked with that I disagreed with so much and yet felt so loved by. And, I came from a world where I was like, okay, these are the things that we need to do. And I hadn't really worked with musicians before. And what I learned is, like, I believed in lines and he believed in no lines. And so, but I think what was most important is he believed that there would be a revolution and it would be led by women and women of color. And so he was like, so for you, like, just for you. I remember I was, a lot of what I spent my time doing is making sure he was good. And so I would sometimes be the one who had hard lines. Like, he would call me and be like, this is what's happening. And he's like, I'm going to tell them to come to you. And my job would be to say no, because he didn't want to say no. And so people would get angry. And someone was like, I'm not coming to Paisley Park if Phaedra's there. And he just was like, then you're just not coming.
Wow.
And to me, it felt like I had leaped and faith and always trying to have his back, and to be able to think like that's my job to say no when he doesn't want to. But then to feel the reciprocal of like, when you do that, I'm for you, was really, really powerful. And so I think believing in women of color, I think believing in me, and what was so brilliant about him is you would think things were unplanned,
right?
But then you would realize how much time and effort he took into planning things. And the thing I always tell my kids is like, he practiced every day.
Wow.
Right. And people like, you're not him. And he practiced every day. And the fact that you don't practice, like at 57, he should have been done practice, right? He didn't have to practice every day. Yeah. But probably my favorite Prince memory is he kind of got mad at people. And so he did sound check himself. And I watched him sound check every instrument. And I was like, oh, he's like knows how to play every instrument on the stage.
Brilliant.
Right?
Wow.
I had not been a student of music. I had not been a student of his. And I think watching that type of brilliance and being connected to it just changed me. And I don't think I've ever been as sad in my life as when he died. In life, you very rarely have people who are just for you. And he was complicated and difficult and a lot of things. But I knew he was for me, and I felt like I was for him. And so I think the idea that just became most clear is like, now I don't have a lot of space and patience for people who aren't for me and I'm not for them. You just start to say like, I only need like 5 people in my life, or a small group of people who are for me. And my real prayer is that kids not just understand, and this next generation, not just understand his music, but they understand his commitment to women, his commitment to justice, his commitment to, like, he was the most radical human I've ever worked with. And I have worked in progressive politics. And it is things like when there'd been an awful victory where the police had killed a young black man. And he went off Twitter. It was always interesting to me. People, like, it was on CNN, Prince quit Twitter. And no one ever made the connection that it was like a form of protest.
Wow.
But to him, it was just like, oh, I don't care. Like, I'm not going to be part of that system. And I looked at, like, he pulled all of his music off streaming services because he felt like philosophically what was happening there to artists and artists of color and the devaluing of content was harmful.
Right.
And then went on Jay-Z's Tidal because he thought that was the vision of the kind of things that he had wanted to build, that he saw people building. He made me way bolder because, look, I don't think I was ever so not liked as I have been connected to working with him ever in my whole life.
You're not going to say no.
Right? And also because he was so private. Like, I think as women, we think like, oh, I need to explain why I'm saying no, or I need to do this. And I think the one thing I always try to do in his life and in his death is to appreciate his privacy and to realize, like, if someone else doesn't understand it, like, that's okay. Yeah. Because the relationship is he and I, not them. Yeah. And so I just learned incredibly so much. And I look forward to a time where it's not sad to think about him.
Well, I want to talk about your latest endeavor, which, I mean, is so exciting, what you're doing with Promise. And I won't even say it's an idea whose time has come. I mean, this is just ridiculously overdue. And, you know, you've got a lot of press about it. You've got significant investors and GCs, Rock Nation, and First Round Capital and whatnot. Yeah. So let me ask you this. From where you and your co-founders, Diana Frappier.
Yeah, that's right.
From where you guys sit, what are the ingredients, the political and cultural times that we find ourselves in right now that set an idea like Promise up for success?
Well, I mean, part of it is I feel like, you know, that it's common sense, right? Mm. And to me, 2/3 of people in jail have not been convicted of the crime they were arrested for. That's insane, right? That's just insane that we incarcerate people who have not been convicted of a crime. And when you're in jail, you're more likely to take a plea deal or do something just to get out.
Right.
And what is just unacceptable to me is that you're most likely to be there when you're poor, black, or brown.
Sure.
And because you can't afford to get out. I also think the reality of the opioid epidemic is that people are starting to see people like in the Midwest are like, wait, this is happening in my community. Like, right. And I think when something happens to your child who's an addict, you don't see them as a criminal, right? You see them as a victim. And so I think there's a big shift in people who see people not as criminals, but as victims. And unfortunately, I think that that too often people haven't understood, like, it's a system of people who are good people who've made bad decisions or who are in bad situations. And so I think that's really important. So I think the time has come because, one, I think the idea that you were in jail because you're poor, black, or brown, I think people realize is unacceptable. The idea that it's considered a violent felony to steal a cell phone. It's such an incredible waste of resources, and it's such a failure, right? It's not no one ever says, oh, they go to jail and prison and it helps them become better people.
Right.
It's the system isn't designed to do that. The system is designed to keep people in the system.
So tell me what Promise is doing specifically, like the inner workings and what the strategy is.
So governments are our clients, and we work with them. There's two types of clients we work with. One are people who have what's called a pretrial system, which is a way for people to get out of jail who haven't been convicted of a crime. And for those people who have it, we help make their system more efficient. So we provide an app to a person who's been arrested so that they get court reminders, they can do check-ins, and that they can manage their experience. And then we give information to the government that says, hey, pay attention to these people, because most people do well. So you really just need to identify, if I have a caseload of a couple hundred people, how do I know who to check in on? So we say red flag for these folks so that they don't get technical violations, because most people end up back in jail for like technical violations or very minor infractions. Then there are our other type of clients, people who don't have those pretrial systems. So we're working with a sheriff in the Midwest where all the people we're working with are people that are in his custody. So we're working there to say, what's the system in which you assess how people get out? What are the conditions of release that you might have? And then how do we provide support to make sure they come back to court, since technically they're actually in the custody of the sheriff?
Got it. I'll just say that ALF in 2016, we held a screening of 13th at Netflix. So Reed Hastings and others were opened up a theater there for us to be able to screen this. We had like 130 people in the network and whatnot go, and the police chief and a judge, and it was a really powerful dialogue. And, as someone, let's say I'm 48 years old, I grew up in the Bay Area, right? Public schools for the most part. And I didn't know this narrative.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that was so, I read, I see things, I hear anecdotally, right? But what was so powerful about that movie is the way that the director, Ava DuVernay, connected the dots through history.
Yeah.
And so I bring this up just because I was so angry.
Yeah.
Everybody in the theater was pretty much angry. And it's like, how in God's name is this not?
Yeah.
How is the new Jim Crow not required reading for every law student and every senior in high school, for Christ's sake, right?
Yeah.
And I went on to learn. I read that. I'm in the kind of educating myself on this. How do you stay balanced?
It's a great question. So one is I exercise, which I think is really important. Two, I, not like 5 people, I remind myself that I only really care about what a certain number of people think about me. And as long as those people feel like I'm doing right, then I'm okay. Like, I really worry if people I love don't think I'm doing right, if that ever happens, or when it does, like, you're being too mean or whatever. Like, okay, readjust. Then I think I take my mental health really seriously. Like, I think I was very depressed after Prince died. I think, but what it reminded me of is that, like, as corny as it sounds, like, really, like, love, family, that's all you really have. And as long as I feel like the people I love feel loved by me, I'm acting out of integrity, and I'm doing what I think will make the world a better place, I really can't ask much more of that for myself. This world is so hard right now. Like, it's just like, feels like just bad stuff happening. And so I just remind myself that to the extent that I can't act out of love, to the extent that I pay more attention to the bad stuff than the good stuff, like, I only become a negative force. And so I just try not to do that. But certainly when I meet people we met with a sheriff in a county that shall remain nameless in the Bay Area. But what was shocking to me is how not progressive the Bay Area was. And how, like, this sheriff in Cass County, North Dakota is more progressive than many of the sheriffs I've met in the Bay Area.
Wow. And
he's saying, like, I'm going to let people try to figure out how to get people out who are in jail. It's not a judge. It's not a pretrial program. He's trying to figure out, because he realizes those people should not be in jail. And that's incredible. And to the extent that people think the Bay Area is innovating, there are amazing places. We have clients in the Bay Area, but there is a lot of innovation happening outside. And for me, that's balanced, because if I were to look and say, here's this white sheriff from Cass County, North Dakota, versus, like, progressive man of color sheriff, I would go like, oh, these are my people. And I just remind myself, no, like, that's my people. Like, he's like, I'm trying to liberate people. This is an unfair system. This is a not. And I'm like, yeah. So I think I have to say balance both personally so that I can act out of the right things, but also professionally, because it is, like we are working in Kentucky, North Dakota, we're talking to Alabama, Nebraska. Like, the fact that innovation is coming. When we were in Nebraska, they said, this is a racially unjust system. And I was like, yes, it is. I was like, yes, it is a racially unjust. But the idea that they were like, we have to correct for these racial injustices. And I was like, this is a white woman on the board of supervisors there who's like, we cannot let this continue. And I was just like, oh, wow. Like, I have to be open to the fact that change may not come from the people I think it comes from.
I was on the board of a homeless services organization in Santa Clara County and sort of participating but not leading in the whole change from, putting a Band-Aid on the problem of homelessness to the Housing First movement. Yeah. And I remember my dear friend and actually ALF classmate Jen Loving said to me, how do we get people to care? Mm-hmm. If it's not directly impacting you, how do you get people to care? And I've, just watched the progression of homelessness in the mainstream, homelessness being talked about all the time in all the media sources in the Bay Area, but just looking in San Jose in particular. So I was thinking about that as we were talking about this problem, right? How do we raise the profile of the epidemic of mass incarceration, in particular men, brown and black men? How do we raise that epidemic so that there are pathways for public engagement? People care, right? How do we do that?
I think a lot about it. And I also think about how we have to make the case for things that aren't popular, right? Like, I look at this guy in Chicago, Jesse Smollett, who would be who has never been convicted of a crime, is in a high risk. And I look at the anger, like, people are like, he should be in jail. And I'm like, no, that's actually not the kind of person that should go to jail. And I think we have to have those type of conversations, even about things like, the one thing I think we can't do is just have safe conversations, like the innocent person, the person who people are all like, oh, it's a mom with like 4 kids. I think we have to have conversations that people who shouldn't be in jail should not be in jail. Like, jail is not the answer. And there are a lot of ways to be punished that are not keeping people behind bars. And so one thing is, I think we have to have unpopular conversations. Because I think people actually know the system is broken. I think people make a decision a lot that their safety is important and that there's dangerous people behind bars. And the challenge is, our system is not good at putting dangerous people behind bars. Our system is good at putting poor people behind bars. And so to the extent that we've created a system that institutionalizes poor people and people of color, that is a system we have to advocate against. And that's where I think we have to be clear, because I'm always shocked when we talk to people and they're like, yeah, I know innocent people die, but it's this. And I'm like, I feel like when we should stop when we say we know innocent people die and say, like, yeah, we should stop. Like, there's not an and then we should fix it. And the fact that we know, like, when you look at this young man who ended up raping this woman, the Stanford swimmer, Brock Turner, and then you look and you're like, yeah, part of why he got out is because he has a family, he has resources, and he has stability. But if he were black or brown, he would never have had that experience. And so the system just recognizes the way it assesses people, says he's low risk, but someone who came out of foster care, they're high risk because they don't have a family. They don't have a place to live. Like, it's the system doesn't measure risk. It measures stability, and usually family stability. And so I think that it's important. One, I think the fact that you're doing this, I'm so happy to hear that ALF is doing that. And I think the more that we have conversations about what the impact is and what the system does, and I think a lot about how the private sector, what I like about the private sector is mostly it's like, did you make profit, good or bad? Okay, did you harm people? That's also bad, but did you make profit?
It's cool.
And the criminal justice system is such a failure because it's like, did you stop people from doing another crime? It fails. It fails. It fails. The punishment does not work. And so it's like, even if you philosophically disagree, the thing that everyone agrees on is the place you are most likely to go to turn into someone who's going to go to jail is jail or prison.
What does success look like for Promise for you in the next few years?
Success for me is, I just want more people out of jail who shouldn't be in jail. And I feel like I want tech companies to solve problems of real people. Like, it's great that we have technology that gets you a dog walker or a nanny or a valet parker. But like, that's not what most people I grew up with are worried about. It's like, how do I stay in my house? How can I afford my bills? My car's breaking down. My family's in crisis. And And I think to the extent that technology doesn't solve any of those problems, it's fundamentally broken.
Which speaks to how diverse tech companies
Right.
are or aren't in
Right.
their lived experience, right?
Right. So success to me is not just solving, I think, and contributing to some of the amazing work that's happening to reduce incarceration, but it's also creating the space and place for people who think about the world and to solve the problems that they deal with. Because we raised a lot of money and people are like, oh my God, this is so great. You're the list of like number X of Black women who've raised money. And I was like, that is such a failure that there's a list of so few Black women who've raised over $1 million, which is such a low threshold for venture capital. Venture mostly fails, right?
Yeah.
And so it's much more likely that we will fail than succeed.
But you're changing the narrative.
Right. But I think that my hope is that one of us will. And to me, that's an incredible victory. If not me, if someone else, I would, certainly I want it to be me, but if not, and we create the space for someone else, then it's worth it.
It's a win.
It's a win.
I'm really grateful that you continue to have the courage to have uncomfortable conversations.
Thanks.
And you model taking care of yourself and really as a leader through that.
Thanks.
So can't wait to see what you do next, Phaedra.
Me either. I'm so happy to spend time together. Thank you.
This podcast was made possible by the ALF Silicon Valley Network, with a special thanks to our Leadership Circle members and the 2024 Exemplary Leadership Celebration premier sponsors, Class 14, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, HP, Silver Lake, Adobe, Salesforce, San Francisco Foundation, and Destination Home. Thank you.
ALF joins and strengthens diverse leaders, creating and supporting networks for good. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and encourage you to subscribe to The Dialogue on iTunes or SoundCloud. To learn more about ALF, visit us online at alfsv.org.